Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. Now today we're going to be drawing really cute animals in cups, and this is a video that you can completely customize. I'm going to draw a cat, but I'm going to give you tips on drawing a bunny, a dog, really whatever you want. And there may or may not be a giveaway in this video, so make sure you stick around for that. As usual here, I'm going to be drawing in an app called Procreate on the iPad Pro, but you can really follow along with whatever, especially any kind of digital tool, but also probably pencil and paper, maybe paint if you want. It doesn't matter a whole lot. And we're first going to start with a rough design sketch. So here, this is the part where I was telling you if you want to customize, you can customize. So go ahead, I'm going to hide my example and create a new layer and rename that new layer to Sketch. Now, I personally like to sketch with a neutral gray, but if you have a preference that is different, please go ahead and pick whatever you want. And same thing with the brushes here. Throughout the entire video, I'm going to give you a few different suggestions on different kinds of brushes you can use. So free Procreate brushes, different software alternatives, or at least I'm going to do my best to give you ways to find alternatives in different software. I'm going to suggest brushes from my Ultimate Illustration bundle, really a bunch of different options that you can use to get a result that is similar to mine, depending on your own software and preferences. And especially for the sketch, I recommend using a brush you know you're comfortable with because that's going to make the biggest difference. That could mean if you're working with Procreate and you're using free brushes, going in the sketching pack, that's what I would recommend at least. Picking the HB pencil, that's one I really like. It's quite easy to use. If you're working in different software, maybe trying to find something that has pencil in the name, that could be a good option. And if you do have my illustration bundle in the texture pack, you could pick the sketching brush. And again, I want to make that very clear, these brushes are not essential at all, but if you do want to check them out, there will be a link in the description below, and there's always a special promo code for the YouTube people. Then no matter which brush you're using, we're going to start with just a very simple rectangle, very rough, very quick as you can see, which is going to help us place the cup. And you can really have any shape cup you want. I'm going to go with a very classic mug. So slightly rounded at the bottom, quite tall, but also quite chunky. And as you can see, the goal in this design sketching phase is to find our ideas, find our concept. So it's not about pretty lines. Don't have to worry about that for now. Really just focus on figuring out what kind of piece you want to draw. So yeah, I'm going to go with this thick U shape right here. And to make it a cup, I'm just going to draw an oval at the top. And from there, we're going to add the handle. So just draw two ovals on the cup where you want the handle to connect with the rest of the cup. And then going from the top of the top oval to the bottom of the bottom oval, you can really draw whatever shape you want. So you could have a very simple C curve like this, or you could have something maybe that goes upwards first and then down. So it's more of a kind of a half heart. If you can see, that's kind of this half. So you have really a few different options. I would recommend trying to make sure it pokes out enough so that you can see the background through the handle, just for readability of your piece and your composition. And then if you want, you could go ahead and just draw the inside piece as well. But if you want to make sure that the thickness is going to be pretty consistent, a trick that you can use is essentially mapping the volume of your handle. And you can do that by drawing a bunch of those ovals. So the same kind of oval, but you just rotate it as the handle rotates. Something like that. Okay, so now we have the cup, nothing super fancy here. Now we're going to move on to drawing the animal. And the animal is something you can very easily customize just by changing things like the ears and maybe the nose and the whiskers. Now we're all going to start with the same basic shape, which is going to be a circle at the very top of the cup. You can see it's going to be pretty much the exact same width as the cup. And I say circle, but it doesn't need to be perfect at all for now. Then to make the piece a little bit more interesting in terms of composition, but also to help the transition between the cup and the animal, you may consider adding a scarf. So what you can do is just connect the side of your cup to the side of your animal head, so the circle for now, and then just match the curve you use for the top of the cup at the top of those two lines. And now that we have that, we can go back and add the facial features on the animal. To make it a little bit easier, you might want to draw a slightly curved vertical line, and then a slightly curved horizontal line, which is what I call the plus sign, just so that we can have all the facial features aligned. And from there, you can add the nose in the intersection of that plus sign. I'm going with a triangle nose, but you could have a rectangle, you could have an oval, you can have a heart. Really here, play with simple shapes, but put it at the intersection. Essentially, that's really all that matters. I also want a really big, cute, happy mouth, so I'm going to draw this rounded W. But once more, there's a bunch of different shapes you could have. You could have, for example, if you have your nose right here, you could have an inverted V that looks a bit more serious. That could work really well for a dog. You could have just one little line, for example, if you have a bunny. That's what I usually draw. You could even have like a totally separate mouth that is not connected, that looks more cartoonish. Well, more cartoonish. Those are all cartoonish. But really, you can combine a bunch of very simple lines and shapes and completely change the animal. And then the eyes also is something very customizable. You could go with tiny black little eyes like this. That's super cute. But I'm going for super happy, chill animal. So I'm personally just going to stick with long upward curves. And again, the ears is really what we're going to use to customize the animal. So if you're not exactly sure, go ahead and look at a reference picture of the animal you want to draw and try to see what is the most simple shape that would represent that ear. So for example, again, a cat, I feel like just very simple triangles, quite low on the sides of the head is a really good way to do that. Could be a case for a dog as well, depending on the type of dog. Otherwise, it might be more of a floppy rectangle like this, but on the side of the head. If you have a bunny, that would be probably more on the top of the head, and it would be these huge inverted hues. So really just using a very simple shape, you can completely transform the animal you're drawing. You can also add a few whiskers. I like to add them in groups of 3. And you can also add any other detail you want to your animal, especially if you're drawing a specific animal like your pet or something. If they have a special mark or like a color or something you want to add, go ahead and add it at this stage. Otherwise, we're going to move on to drawing the paws. So the paws are going to be essentially between the scarf and the cup. And so you can just draw these big teardrop shapes. And to make them look like paws instead of just blobs, I personally like to add these little simple curves, and really not much more than that. And from there, all we're missing in our piece is the floppy part of the scarf, so we're going to go ahead and sketch that. And here we really need to think about the different volumes that are in our piece. So I'm having this end of the scarf poke out on the left side of the animal and going slightly over the paw. So it's going to have this kind of angle first because, yeah, it's resting a little bit on the paw as well as on the edge of the cup. Then it's falling down, so you can imagine pretty straight line here. Whoops. And then when it hits the floor, we don't really see the floor because we don't have a line or anything, but you can imagine the cup is resting on the floor. It's going to essentially flick towards us. So there's going to be this angle, but since it's coming towards us, instead of going both in the same direction, we're going to use perspective, which means the scarf is going to get bigger towards us. So we're going to draw this kind of shape instead. So once you have your basic design, it is really important to take the time to just play with the different proportions as well as playing with adding extra elements. For example, you could add a very simple hat. I'm just going to add a bright shining star on top of the head. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I just think it's really cute, so I'm going to add that. But on top of adding those elements, yes, playing with proportions, playing with your lines. It doesn't need to look good yet in terms of the cleanliness of your line, but it needs to be an interesting composition and you need to be happy with the angles of different things. For example, I feel like the head that I drew or the facial features are a little bit too much towards this side. So it would be the perfect time for me to use my selection tool, whatever you have in your software, setting it so that you can draw a comfortable selection. In Procreate, I like to set it to freehand, and then just drawing a selection around whatever you want to move. So in my case, the facial features, and then, well, moving them around until you're happy with their placement. So again, it's okay if it looks all crazy and wonky, but I already much prefer this to that. So anything you want to move, any proportion you want to change, even if right now you're happy with your piece, see if there's something that you can move to make it even better. So any kind of distortion tool, warp tool you have, just experiment with those a little bit. Even if it's for 30 seconds and you decide to go back with what you had, just play with it a little bit. Just see if you could change the proportions to like them even more. I feel like my cup is too big compared to the cat. I want the animal to be the spotlight. So I'm actually going to roughly select the cup and then distort it by smushing it so that the proportion is more cat and less cup versus this. I think that's better. So feel free to pause the video here, take all the time you need to play with your proportions until you're happy with your basic design, and we're all going to meet up in the next chapter, which is going to be adding the colors. Awesome! So once you have your basic design, we're going to make it look like a proper illustration by adding colors, a little bit light and shadow, as well as textures. Now, if you want, you can obviously pick your own colors, but if you want to do like I am doing, I provided the color palette I will be using. You can download it for free. The link is in the video description, and it is part of my Procreate Jumpstart Kit, which is a bundle of freebies. So there's brushes, templates, a bunch of other palettes, and really a whole lot of cool stuff. So all of that, again, I'll link in the description below. It is totally free, but you can also pick your own colors, of course, no worries with that. And we're actually going to start by setting the background because I want my cat to be cream, and if the background is white, we're not going to see much. So go ahead and either create a background layer if you're working in different software. If you're working in Procreate, there's always one, so you can just go ahead and select that. And we're just going to set it to a really nice dark green. So in the color palette, I'm going to pick this one right here. It is in the middle of this forest green column. And as you can see here, it is pretty much middle of the way in terms of saturation, but it is really quite dark. Now from there, it's going to be very easy. We're going to start by color blocking the different elements on separate layers. I'm going to start with a cat because I'm really excited about it, but you can really do whatever you want. So just create a new layer. In my case, again, I'm drawing a cat, so I'm going to rename my layer to cat. And my cat, I want it to be a nice, cute little cream, so I'm going to pick this cream right here at the top, and I might actually make it a little bit brighter and maybe more on the orange side. I'm going to add the hex code on the top right if you want to follow exactly the same colors I am using again. But as you can see, kind of an orange that is really desaturated and really bright. And here in terms of brushes, it doesn't matter at all. As long as you have a solid shape, that's really all you need. So if you're working with free Procreate brushes, that could mean going in the airbrushing pack, picking the hard brush, and making sure your opacity is at 100% for that brush. If you're working in different software, just the most basic round brush you have that doesn't have any texture or feathering is what you want to go for. But if you do have my illustration bundle, go ahead and pick the base round brush. And here, all we're going to do is we're going to pick, honestly, whatever size brush you're comfortable with and you feel like you're able to get enough details with. And you're going to outline the shape of the element you want to color block. So in my case, I'm color blocking the cat. So I'm just going to create an outline of the cat so that I can then fill it in and have this cream silhouette of a cat. And during the sketching phase, it was not important to have clean, nice lines, but in the color blocking part, it is super important that you're happy with your silhouettes. So take the time to make sure you do this step well, otherwise the other steps are going to be much more difficult for you. So once you have the head, don't forget the paws. And the paws, you want to make sure they look like they're going in the cup. So you're going to have this little hook, or I guess a candy cane since we're doing holiday theme illustration. This kind of shape instead of just a straight line. So that, yeah, it looks like the paw is actually going inwards as opposed to just upwards and then stops there. Again, make sure you're really happy with your silhouettes. And if you're struggling to visualize your silhouette without the lines, one thing you can do is take your sketch layer, put it above the color blocking you're doing, and set your sketch layer to the blending mode multiply. So to do that, all you have to do is figure out where the opacity of your layers are in your software. In Procreate, it is just by tapping on the little N right here, and then scrolling until you see multiply. And essentially what that does is now the sketch is going to blend a little bit with the colors underneath, which is going to help you see it a little bit better, but also it's going to allow you to lower the opacity of your sketch while still seeing the lines on the dark sections. So I'm just, yes, going to set my sketch to the blending mode multiply, and I'm also going to lower the opacity, not too much because I want you to see it in the video, but in your case, consider lowering it quite a lot until you can just barely see it, so it's not too much in the way, but so you can still use it as a reference. And from there, we're just going to keep color blocking the different elements we have on separate layers. So I'm going to move on to the cup next. So just creating a new layer below the cat because the cat is on top and above the mug. And I'm going to rename it to cup. Now in this illustration, I'm just going for something Christmassy, so I want my cup to be red, but you could have a completely different vibe for your illustration, so just pick your color accordingly. But I'm gonna go with this red right here in the color palette. As you can see, pretty much middle of the way in terms of brightness, and it is quite saturated. Otherwise, same thing, just drawing a really nice outline of the shape you want to use, and then fill it in to create the silhouette. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and leave me a comment with which animal you're drawing. Now, if you're new on the channel, you might be a little bit confused with the secret password. It does a few things, especially when they're a giveaway. The first thing being that, although it might sound crazy, it gives me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, and it genuinely does help me create better videos for you. So that is reason number one, which applies to every single videos. But in the case of giveaways, the secret password is also your key to enter. All the giveaway details and rules are going to be in the video description, so make sure you go ahead and check that out. But long story short, in this video, you can win whichever brush set you want from my store. So that could be, for example, the illustration bundle, that could be my big brush bundle, really whatever you want. I'm going to pick, let's go with 2 winners. And the way to enter, as you're going to see in the rules, is to leave a comment below on this video on YouTube with, again, which animal you're drawing, and on Instagram. Now, if you don't have Instagram, don't worry, I have ways to enter for you as well. Oh, and to make it as fair as possible, even if you already have all of my brushes, which I know a lot of you do, if you still enter and if you win, I will just refund one of your past purchases. So anyone can enter, anyone has a chance to win. And you might notice that you're really happy with your outline or even just your sketch, but then when you create the silhouette, it looks off somehow. that is totally normal. A line looks very different than a shape, so if your lines looked good but then your shapes are off, it doesn't matter. Just take the time to make sure you're happy with the shapes in the end. Great, and then we're just going to keep going, color blocking any other element you have. In my case, I also have the scarf, but you could have a collar, a hat, whatever. So I'm just going to create a new layer, this time above the cup, because the scarf is above the cup, and below the cat. In theory, it's kind of above and below, but I'm just going to put it between the cat and the cup, and that should be totally fine. Now my scarf, I kind of want it to match with the cup, so I'm just going to go with a lighter version of my red. So just right here in the color palette, but as you can see, otherwise it's the same hue, it is just quite a bit brighter and quite a bit less saturated as well. Now I'm already noticing that I want to move some of my elements around, but before that I'm going to draw the last element I need to add in my color blocking, which is a little star on the head. So I'm just going to create a new layer above everything this time, and I'm going to rename that new layer to star. And for the star, I'm just going to go with the same base color as the cat. And there's a bunch of different methods to drawing stars, so just use whichever one you're most comfortable with. I personally, these days, have been drawing all the branches one by one as opposed to drawing this little, trick. I just like the result more like that, but again, whatever method you're comfortable with, if you want to draw a star, is the one you should use. And here, since we've been drawing everything on separate layers, we still have the option to move stuff around very easily. So that's exactly what we're going to do before we start adding the shadows, the lights, and the details. So for that, you can just go through the different layers and do appropriate selections. So for example, I want to move that hand a little bit more under the scarf. So I'm just going to go back on the cat layer, using my selection tool, and then I'm going to move it so it's more under the scarf. One problem I'm going to have though is, since my scarf layer is under the cat, I'm going to need to go back in with my eraser and erase that part of the paw that I want to be below the scarf. Now another thing that was working in the sketch but not in these color shapes is this candy cane hook. It is fine on the sketch, it connects with the top of the cup, but not here. It's like the hand is floating. So I definitely need to go ahead, select that hand or that paw, and just put it a little bit lower so it actually touches the cup. So once more, feel free to pause the video here, take all the time you need to color block the different elements, make sure you move them around as much as you need, because the next chapter we're going to all meet up in is going to be adding shadows and details, and once we start adding those, it's much harder to move stuff around. So really, it's worth taking the time to do it well now. Awesome, so once you're happy with your basic colors, your basic color blocking, we're going to start adding the details and the shadows, which should be fairly straightforward, but it's really going to bring the piece together because honestly right now it looks super boring. So we're going to start with the facial features because that's probably the most fun. So go ahead and create a new layer above everything you have so far and rename that new layer to facial features. And here for the facial features, you can go with whatever you want. I'm probably going to go with a combination of dark brown and dark gray. So I'm going to start with this brown right here in the color palette. That is the hue I'm going to use, but I'm going to make it really quite a bit darker. Again, if you want the exact color, the X code is going to be on the top right here. And I want this piece to be kind of soft and cozy. So instead of using a really sharp and clean brush for outlines and details, I'm actually going to use the exact same brush as I used for the sketch. So really something super, yes, cartoony, textured, and inviting and warm. Which means if you are using free Procreate brushes in the sketching pack, the HB pencil. Now, if you're working in a different software, something that has pencil in the name and feels soft and fluid is going to work just fine. And if you do have my illustration bundle, usually at this stage I would say the outlines brush, but we're going to actually stick with the sketching brush here. And then you're just going to figure out which size you need. So that's going to depend on which brush you're using, the size of your canvas, as well as your own preferences in terms of comfort, but also the kind of details you want. So just go ahead and try a few sizes until you find something you like, and then just stick with that. So in my case here, I'm going with, what is it? Yeah, kind of between 2 and 3%, it seems like, on the higher side of 2. But again, that's really going to depend on your own preferences. And I tend to go a little bit thinner so that I can stack my strokes and create that kind of sketching texture here, if that makes sense at all. So instead of having just one big thick pencil, I have 3 strokes in there and they're not perfectly aligned. So it creates a little bit more of that texture and grit. I might have a slightly shorter nose than what I sketched. And I'm going to leave one part of the top not colored to make it look like a highlight. And here again, since I want that nice texture, I'm not using the color drop option. I'm really just filling it in manually quite quickly so that there is some of that unevenness. Now, if you have whiskers, don't forget to add them on that layer. I know in theory they're not really facial features, but this is still where we're going to add them. Great, so at this stage, go ahead and hide the sketch. We won't need it anymore. Everything should be mapped out on your piece. And we're going to keep adding details. And the other details, I like to just draw them all on one layer. I like to have the facial features separate so that I can move them around if needed. But for the other details, just all the little lines and the textures, we can go ahead and draw them all on one layer. So go ahead and create that one layer that I keep talking about below the facial features, but above everything else you have. And rename that new layer to details. So this piece, again, like I was saying, I want to feel really cozy and warm and kind of hand-drawn, or like more traditional, I guess. So I'm going to add a few darker strokes around my different elements. So that's what we're going to start with in terms of details, but then we're going to come back and add, for example, patterns on the cups and the scarf as well. But for now, go ahead and color pick whatever element you want. In my case here, I'm going to go with the cat to start with. Make that color a little bit darker and more saturated as well, so just bringing it down towards the right corner. And then with the same sketching, flowy pencil brush, just go around that element that you picked the color from and add these very flowy, soft strokes. So it's a bit of a mix between details, outlines, line art, texture. It's really a cross between all of those. And it's really going to build that interest in the piece pretty quickly. Again, right now it's super flat, but by adding those already, it's going to come to life a lot more. You may also add a bit of a detail in the ear. Maybe tiny little groups of hair, not a whole lot, but I like to just draw a few strands here and there, just again to help build a piece a little bit. Then doing the exact same thing with the paws, making sure this time you draw between the fingers, but otherwise just keep adding those soft, very fluid and quick sketch-like outlines. Maybe a few hair groups here and there as well, but you definitely do not want to overdo it on those. So something very simple like this, you can see it makes a big difference already, but we're going to keep doing it, and especially with these darker colors is going to make even more of a difference. So speaking of which, I'm going to move on to the scarf. Still on the same details layer again. At this point, everything should stay in place, so it doesn't matter if we're drawing on one layer. Just color picking your scarf color and making it darker. And then going over and drawing your loose outlines. And it is very possible that right now these outlines are going to blend with the cup. Don't worry, that's totally okay. Just keep drawing them. They're going to come out later. You could also add these little fluffy details at the end of the scarf if you do have a scarf. I think it makes it just so much more fun. And once you're done with the scarf, moving on to the cup. So just color picking the cup, making it quite a bit darker, and then otherwise same thing, just outlining your shape. And here you can bring back the little line that we had when we did the oval for the opening of the cup, just to show, yeah, the thickness of the cup. And if you need to bring your sketch back for the handle, that is totally okay. Just make sure you're drawing on the correct layer, so the details layer. Sometimes when we go back and reactivate layers or hide layers, we end up drawing on the wrong one afterwards. So yes, totally okay to reactivate your sketch at any point. Just make sure that you go back to the details layer afterwards. And I'm also going to add this kind of branch under the star. I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but in my mind, maybe the animal is kind of marshmallow or something. So it's, I don't know, but there you go. And I'm also going to add very simple cheek details on, well, the cheeks, and I'm going to draw them in very pale pink. So I'm just going to use my scarf as a reference here and turn it into a nice blush pink by making it really bright and desaturated. And here you can have obviously no cheeks if you want, but you could experiment with a few different kinds. Maybe big circles. That's always cute. Maybe smaller circles or ovals in that case. Little, that's too big of a brush, but these little shy wiggles, that could be cute. I'm gonna go with 3 little vertical ovals. I don't know why, I've never done it before, but I was really called to do that for this piece. Okay, so from there we're going to keep adding details. I'm going to move on to adding a few patterns, mainly on the scarf and the cup, just to make them a little bit less flat. You could totally customize this step as really any other step, of course, but this especially is something you can customize to make the piece your own, so feel free to completely go off rail. But one thing I would suggest is using clipping mask, which is essentially just a layer that you create above whatever element you want to work on. So in my case, I'm going to start with the scarf. So creating a new layer above the scarf. I'm going to rename it to scarf pattern. And if you apply that layer as a clipping mask, whatever you draw on it is going to stay within whatever shape you apply it to. So for example, if I tap here on my scarf pattern layer, select clipping mask from the menu, there's a little arrow that appears pointing at the scarf layer. So now the scarf pattern layer is applied as a clipping mask on the scarf. So whatever I draw on the scarf pattern layer is going to stay within the shape of the scarf. So long story short, for example, if I go ahead and color pick the color of my cup here, I can very quickly go in and draw these lines, and they're going to stay within the scarf, which means you can add a bunch of patterns, a bunch of gradients, whatever you want, without having to worry about staying within the lines. So I'm just going to keep going with these lines because this is exactly the color I want to use, the same color as the cup, but onto the scarf, and still with these very loose sketch-like lines. I'm going to, yes, draw this line pattern on the entire scarf, starting with horizontal lines on this part of the scarf that is flopping over. And then switching to vertical lines on the part of the scarf that is around the animal. So you can see it's very quick, but it makes a huge difference. Now I'm also going to add a pattern on the cup, and that pattern I want it to be exactly the same star as the one on the top of the head. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my layer by swiping it towards the left with one finger and selecting duplicate. I'm going to pick whichever copy, it doesn't matter, and I'm going to move it with my arrow tool until it is on top of the cup. Now here I want it to be straight. My top one is kind of slightly angled, but I want this one to be actually perfectly straight and maybe a little bit smaller as well. So I'm just going to distort that real quick. Then I'm going to place it wherever I want it to be. For now, I'm just going to start with the middle of the cup. Now to create the actual pattern around the cup, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create each column one by one. So I'm going to start with this middle column here. So I'm just going to bring the star layer above the cup just so I don't confuse it with this star on the top of the head. And I'm going to duplicate it enough times so that I have enough stars to create one column. So I think I'm going to go probably with, let's go with 4. And then I'm just going to move each of those copies to create my column. And right now they are going to spill up the cup, but it doesn't matter. At this stage, we're just worrying about the pattern itself. Now I feel like they still might be a little bit too big, so I'm going to select all of my layers by swiping them all towards the right with one finger, going back to my arrow tool, and then making them smaller. So once you have one column you're happy with, we're going to go ahead and merge all of the layers within that column. And with Procreate, the way to merge layers is very simple. You just squish them all together. And from there, we're going to duplicate that column and just move it around to create the pattern. Swapping it towards the left with one finger, selecting duplicate, and then moving it and kind of staggering the pattern. And here, because the pattern is curving away from us, we're also going to distort this column a little bit. So just switch from uniform to distort and just squish that column a little bit and maybe rotate it a little bit as well, just so it follows the cup a little bit better. So we're going to do the same thing once more, duplicate that new copy we just created, and then moving it to keep the pattern repeating. Maybe squishing it a little bit more, again, because it's going towards the edge. And maybe rotating it a little bit more as well. And then we're going to repeat on the other side, so just going back to your original copy that doesn't have any distortion on it. Duplicating that, and yeah, repeating the exact same steps, but on the other side. And once you have your pattern, go ahead and merge all of those columns you've just created so that you have only one pattern layer. Speaking of which, rename that layer to pattern. And then just like we did on the scarf, we're going to apply that pattern as a clipping mask so that the shape stays within the cup. So just tapping on it and selecting clipping mask, and now it is within the cup. And while we're here, you might want to experiment with either the opacity to make your pattern more transparent or more opaque, or you could even just scroll through the blending mode list and see if there's one that you like. I'm gonna go with soft light. I think it's very simple, and I might lower the opacity a little bit as well. Probably leaving it around, I don't know, 60%. Now the clipping mask is helping the pattern stay within the cup, but it's still going to overlap with the handles. So if your pattern is like mine overlapping with your handle, make sure you go ahead and erase that real quick. Awesome! Now right before we move on to adding the lights and shadows, we're going to very quickly paint the background. So just go ahead and create a new layer, put it below everything you have so far, and rename that new layer to Pine Needles. For that, go ahead and color pick the color you use for the background and make it slightly darker. Not a whole lot, just a little bit. And here you have a few different options on how to draw the pine needles. If you want, you could just go ahead and draw it, manually one by one. So just a slightly curved line in the middle, and then you add the needles themselves. Kind of like this. So you could totally go ahead and do that, just draw a bunch of those. But if you're working with Procreate, I included in my Procreate Jumpstart Kit a free pine needle brush that you can download. Again, it is free. It is in the Nature Pack. If I can find it right here, you're going to see pine needles. And this is essentially a stamp brush, so you can very quickly add those pine needles in the background. So I'm going to do one layer of pretty dark pine needles everywhere on the background, again, quite randomly. And once we have those dark pine needles in the background, we're going to go back to color picking the original green we have, so a little bit lighter than the pine needles, and we're going to make it even lighter and a little bit less saturated. So essentially going towards the gray and a little bit brighter as well. And here you're probably going to have to test, but the idea is we want to have some slightly paler pine needles, this time focusing them on the edges. So again, feel free to pause the video here, take all the time you need to add any other details you want, refine the background if you want, and then we're going to meet up in the next step. We're going to add some lights and shadows, which is really going to bring the piece to life. Awesome! So at this stage, we're almost done. We're just going to add some quick lights and shadows to really transform the whole piece, starting with some shadows. So go ahead and create a new layer above everything you have in terms of color blocking, but below any details layer you have. So in my case, below details, but above star. And rename that new layer to shadows. And here you could go ahead and color pick the different colors you have, make them darker, and then draw your shadows that way. But to be more efficient, we're going to pick one color that we're going to use for all of the shadows, but we're going to apply the shadow layer we just created as a blending mode. And because it is going to be a blending mode, essentially Procreate or whatever software you're going to be using is going to take that one color you're using to paint and it's going to blend it and change it depending on what is underneath. So again, we briefly touched on that with the patterns as well as the sketch, but blending modes are usually in the same area as the opacity. So in Procreate, you can just tap on the little N next to the check mark. And the blending mode we're going to use here is linear burn. Now you may also want to lower the opacity around 50% for now, but you can always play with that as you go. And you can experiment with a bunch of different colors here for your shadows. The only thing I would recommend is avoiding a neutral gray because those are just going to create muddy shadows. So anything that has a bit of color to it is going to work well. I usually go with a grayish purple. Here, because I have a lot of reds and a lot of cream, I'm actually going to go with a grayish pink. So this kind of dirty pink right here. But again, you can experiment with a bunch of things. And just go back to whatever brush you were using for the sketching and the details. So in my case, I was literally the sketching brush. And with the same kind of loose sketching motion we've been using, we're going to add some very simple shadows, starting with the bottom corners, I guess. It's not really corners, but the bottom section of the head of the animal. So it's just something very simple like this. Can add a little bit in the ears if you want. Then moving on to the scarf, so just a little bit at the bottom of the scarf as well as kind of this little nook right here when it's flipping over. Then you can add a little bit of a shadow where the paws meet the cup as well, both on the cup and on the paws. You can definitely add a shadow under that scarf to help make it pop. But again, nothing super complicated. we're still doing this very loose sketching motion. I'm also going to add quite a big shadow towards the bottom of the cup, just to make it a little bit less flat. But I'm not going to add a shadow on that very bottom edge, just to help make it pop from the background a little bit more. I'm also going to add a shadow on the handle itself, so focusing on the bottom, but following the shape and the volume. Something a little bit like this. Still leaving a gap between the shadow and the actual edge of the piece. Now I'm realizing here I didn't leave a gap, so I'm just going to very quickly come back in with my eraser and erase a little bit of that shadow. It's a small detail, but I feel like it just, as you can see here, it really does help the cup pop from the background, so I think it's worth it. Now the scarf, I'm pretty much going to leave it as is, although I might add a bit of a shadow here to create a fold, so in line with the bottom of the cup, but otherwise that's really all we're going to do. Now if you feel like you have a bit too rough edge in your shadows, that's totally normal. When we're doing this sketching motion, it adds a lot of texture, but it can also create these very rough strokes. So if that's the case, feel free to use any kind of smudge tool you have. Usually it's going to be a finger icon. In Procreate, it is right here. But make sure you set it to some sort of brush that has texture. It honestly doesn't matter much what kind of texture, but you want to avoid having a soft brush. So a charcoal, a pencil, a painting brush that has texture is totally golden. I like to use a free brush that comes with Procreate. It is in the painting pack, the stucco brush, if I can find it. Oh, right here. But essentially you can use that to, without hoping to create a perfect gradient, that is really not what we want, but you can use that to just blend in the edge of your shadow a little bit better. So you want to retain that nice texture that we created, but you can just make it a little bit softer and a little bit less sketchy, I guess. Now we're also going to add a shadow below the cup. So go ahead and create a new layer. Put it below everything you have, but above the background. So below the cup, but above the pine needle. And rename that to ground shadow. And here we're also going to use the blending mode linear burn. So just go ahead and pick that from the menu. And then you can just very quickly paint a shadow on the ground. And once you have it painted, feel free to go back and play with the opacity until you find something you like. I think I'm going to go with 72. And using a very similar technique, we're going to add a bit of a gradient or vignette effect, I guess, on the piece. So just go ahead and create a new layer still below the cup, but above the background. Rename that new layer to vignette. And with the same color, go ahead and draw a U shape that is around the cup and the animal. And then go back in and fill in those edges very quickly. Then to create the vignette, we're also going to use the blending mode linear burn. So just going back in your layers, picking a linear burn, and playing with the opacity. I'm probably going to keep mine quite high, so around 70%. And we're going to blend the edges, so using the smudge tool that we used for the other shadow elements. Finding a size that you're comfortable with, and very loosely and quickly blending those edges to create that gradient vignette effect. And the last thing we have to do is add some lights, starting with the star. And for that, we're going to duplicate the star layer. So swiping it towards the left with one finger. We're going to pick the bottom copy. And we're also going to use a blending mode. This one is going to be add. So same thing in the opacity section, but this time going towards the bottom, picking add. And we're going to add some blur to that star, which is going to create the glow effect. So any kind of blur you have in your software is going to work well. If you have something called Gaussian blur, that is perfect. In Procreate, it is here in the adjustment panel, Gaussian blur right here. And you can add as much or as little blur as you want, which is going to, as you can see, create a bit of a glow. Now to keep with the texture and sketch feel, I'm also going to add a separate glow layer on which I'm going to draw a bunch of rings of light. Not realistic at all, but that's something I like to do to really emphasize the glow of something. So just creating a new layer below the original star, but above that glow we have. And we're going to rename that new layer to glow. Just like we did here, we're going to also use the blending mode add. And here we're going to pick a nice, warm, bright yellow color. So I'm going to go with this one right here in the color palette. You can see it's this orange. It is super bright, quite desaturated. And with the same sketching brush we've been using for the entire thing, you're just going to draw essentially this kind of big spiral around the star. And you should have a lot of strokes around the star, and it should get progressively less dense as you go outwards. Now you could have it in front of the animal if you want. I'm just going to put mine behind the animal, but above the vignette. And I feel like mine is a little bit too opaque, so I'm actually going to go back and lower the opacity of that layer. And the very last thing we have to do is add some highlights on the different elements. So you can go back and create a new layer below the details, but above the shadows we have for the piece. Rename that new layer to highlights. Again, using the blending mode add, but probably lowering the opacity quite a bit. I'm going to set it to, let's go with 25% here. And we're just going to draw some highlights, some localized highlights. So I'm going to draw one on the top of the handle right here, with maybe some extra shininess like this. Actually, 25 is a little bit too low. I'm going to increase mine. Let's go with 46, so around 50%. I'm going to add that same kind of highlight on this part of the handle with the extra shininess. Maybe a little bit at the top right here. Some very loose, sketchy lines on the top of the scarf, top of the paws, and the top of the head. And just like for the shadows, don't hesitate to use your smudge tool to blend in those lights a little bit if you feel like they're a little bit too harsh. And if you have some whiskers, you may actually want to go back on the facial features layer and add a bit of that highlight on top of the whiskers just to help make them pop from the background. If you enjoyed this video and want more holiday themed tutorials, I highly recommend you check out this playlist because I have a bunch more for you. But before you leave, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos I post every Tuesday and Saturday. Then click on the link right here and I'll meet you there.